This week we start a new book of the Torah, Vayikra, a sefer that many people quietly dread. Its opening chapters describe the laws of offerings brought in the Mishkan, laws that were later applied to the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem. We may not fully understand why animal or grain offerings were brought, but we're familiar with them. We understand the concept that they're brought as part of the Torah's narrative, the one we grew up hearing. What often slips past us is a quieter element that appears in the background of almost every korban: salt. In Vayikra we read, "V'chol korban minchatecha b'melach timlach v'lo tashbit melach brit Elohecha me'al minchatecha al kol korbanecha takriv lecha." You shall add salt with your offerings and a grain of salt. You should not take away salt from all your offerings. With all your offerings, you must offer salt. The Torah insists, not some offerings, not only meat offerings, all korbanot must have salt. Now, today we know salt is something we use the kosher meat to draw out the blood, and as that basic ingredient that makes food come alive. But for a simple flour offering, this salt doesn't sound merely functional. It sounds symbolic, almost ritual in its own right. The medieval commentator Ibn Ezra, who traveled across Spain, North Africa, and Italy, and was known for his sharp pshat, basic, and love of grammar and reason, gives a very down-to-earth explanation. On the phrase melach brit Elohecha, the salt of your covenant with God, he writes that God brought us into a covenant and made us swear not to offer anything unsalted and inedible, because that would be an insult. In other words, don't bring God food you yourself would refuse to eat. Salt here is part of basic human dignity and respect. You don't invite a beloved guest and serve stale, flavorless food. You don't approach God with something half-hearted, stripped of the most minimal care. But other commentators, here's something more. The Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, a 13th century Spanish sage who was both halachist and Kabbalist, and who eventually made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, notices that the verse says, Brit Elohecha, the covenant of your God, not Brit Hashem, the covenant of the name, or Adonai, as we might expect. He connects salt to the elements of water and fire. Salt, he says, comes from water that the sun has struck. At first, water soaks into the earth and makes it bring forth and bud. It gives life. But when that same water becomes salt and is poured heavily onto land, it destroys everything, burns the soil. So, lo tisra velo tatzmiach. It's not sown and does not bear. Salt preserves food in the right amount. In excess, it kills. For a Ramban, a covenant, a brit, includes all of God's attributes: kindness and judgment, water and fire. Salt is a physical symbol of that double power. It seasons and sustains the world, but it can also destroy it when misused. That is why the Tanakh speaks of a brit melach olam, an everlasting covenant of salt, with regards to David's dynasty. Just as salt preserves food over time, the covenant preserves the Davidic kingdom. Yet the same covenant contains the possibility of destruction if it is betrayed or distorted. When we take the language of covenant and add too much salt, or turn it into extremism or fanaticism, we can burn people instead of preserving them. In Ramban's words, Habrit hi melach ha'olam, the covenant is the salt of the world. By virtue of it, the world exists, or may be destroyed. Now, a different angle comes from Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, otherwise known as the Chida, an 18th century scholar, bibliographer, and Kabbalist who traveled across Europe and North Africa as an emissary of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. In his commentary, Chomat Anach, he zooms in on the phrase, Velo tashbit melach, do not eliminate the salt. Drawing on the halachic midrash Torah Kohanim, he reads the word tashbit here in connection with salt that does or does not cease. The Chida explains that the ideal salt for the mikdash is melach sdomit, sodomite salt, meaning salt from the region of the Dead Sea around Sodom, because it's never lacking. The sea constantly throws up its waves and deposits more salt on the shore. It's a supply that is never cut off. Now, if that's not available, he notes, one can use another type called melach astronakit. But the ideal is that ever renewing salt. The mitzvah hints that the salt of the covenant should be like that Dead Sea salt, constant, present, not something we let seize from our offerings or our lives. If we move from chemistry and halacha to anthropology, we find yet another layer. Shadal, Shmuel David Luzzatto, a 19th century Italian scholar who combined traditional belief with modern philology and a sensitivity to history, points out that in the Middle Eastern world, covenants have long been made over salt. He notes that even in his own time, Arab leaders, when making a pact, bring a dish of salt, and they eat bread dipped in that salt. Sharing salt and breaking bread show that our lives are now intertwined. We have sat at the same table and can no longer see each other as strangers. Shadalit suggests that already in ancient times, in the cultures around Israel, a covenant was cut in salt. So when the Torah speaks of melach brit Elohecha, the salt of your covenant with God, it's using a language the ancient Near Eastern ear would understand. Every korban is an invitation to bring God to our table, to seal or renew a covenant. The salt on the offering is like the salt on the shared bread, the sign that we and God are bound together. Our story is now bound up with one another. If we put these voices together, the salt in Vayikra begins to feel surprisingly contemporary. Even Ezra reminds us not to bring God offerings that we ourselves would never serve a friend. Our Judaism should not be bland, unthoughtful, or inedible. Ramban warns that a covenant, like salt, is powerful. The same relationship that preserves us as a people can also bring painful consequences if we betray its values and if we oversaturate it, turning commitment into harshness or fanaticism. The Chida invites us to think of our connection to God and to each other as something that should be constant, like the Dead Sea, that waves endlessly deposit new salt on the shore. Not an emotion that appears once a year on Yom Kippur and then disappears. And then Shadal nudges us to see each mitzvah, each Shabbat table, each act of tzedakah as a small bread and salt ceremony in which we renew our brit with the divine, letting God's presence become intertwined with our daily lives. For Jewish tapestry, which note is what used to be Jewish unity through diversity, salt is a beautiful metaphor. On one level, we really do have different amounts of salt in our kitchens. The Yemenite chilba, the Moroccan chaime, the Indian curries, the Ashkenazi pickles. When an Ashkenazi invites a Yemenite friend for Shabbat, or a Bukharan family hosts a Litvak neighbor, the question of too salty or not salty enough, too spicy, not spicy enough, becomes a gentle, humorous way of negotiating difference. But at a deeper level, each community brings its own flavor of Avodat Hashem, its melodies, its customs, its stories. If you remove the salt from any dish, it goes flat. If you remove one community, one tradition from Am Yisrael, from the nation of Israel, something essential is missing from the collective taste. So as we open Sefer Vayikra, instead of turning away from korbanot as something distant, we can let this small command draw us closer. Al kol korbancha takriv melach. With all your offerings, you must offer salt. Maybe today our offerings look like time we give to a communal project, attention we give to a child, money we donate, creativity we pour into Jewish life. The question Vayikra asks is, are we bringing them bland and rushed? Or are we bringing them with thought, with flavor, with the conscious awareness that each act is part of a larger covenant? Each of us in our own corner of the Jewish tapestry can choose to add a little more covenantal salt to what we do, enough to preserve and enrich, but not so much that we burn ourselves or others. And every time we sit down to a table, where Jews of different backgrounds taste each other's food and stories. We are, in a way, fulfilling Shadal's image, eating bread and salt together before God, renewing the bond that holds us as one people and intertwines our lives in a shared, ongoing covenant. Shabbat Shalom.